Common Cause. On election day, we saw more than 10 million Americans, excuse me, make their voices heard at the polls. These voters followed on the heels of more than 82 million people who cast their ballot prior to election day, either in person or by mail. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the southern states as we share their election day report outs, issues encountered on the ground, and their focus on the upcoming legislative session, including some breaking news out of some of our states today. We're going to turn to the state leaders to tell us what they've encountered so far about vital election protection work and that their staff and volunteers conducted. Before we hear from them individually, I would like to introduce all of the speakers joining us on the call today. We have Ann Webb, who is Common Cause North Carolina's Policy Director, Amy Keith, Common Cause Florida Executive Director, Anthony Gutierrez, Common Cause Texas Executive Director, and Jay Young, Senior Common Cause Director of Voting Rights and Democracy. After we hear from all of our state leaders, there will be time later in the conversation for any questions folks in the media might have. Please, as you are listening, we encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please list who your question is directed to, your name, and the name of your outlet. And we're going to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker. It's Ann Webb, Policy Director for Common Cause North Carolina. Ann, take it away.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Ann Webb. I'm Policy Director at Common Cause North Carolina. And this year in North Carolina, we had more than 5.7 million voters cast their ballot. That is a sign here of strong voter confidence in our election system. We also saw a record number of North Carolina voters use early voting this year, which has proved to be the most popular option for casting a ballot in our state. We at North Carolina Common Cause and our partners were at polling places and on our nonpartisan voter hotline as part of our nonpartisan election protection efforts to help North Carolinians resolve any problems with voting. One of the main topics that we were watching closely was the implementation of the voter ID requirement, which was implemented for the first time during a presidential election. It seemed to go fairly smoothly, although we did see an increase in the number of provisional ballots to be counted. And we know that some voters were disenfranchised by the voter ID requirement, and it created some delays in finalizing election results. I want to pause for just a moment and ask if I'm coming through clearly or if there's a lag.
You are fine on our end.
Okay, thank you. In the 2 weeks since Election Day, Common Cause has been observing with our partners the County Board of Elections meetings in the post-election canvassing period, and we've been in more than 75 out of 100 counties here in North Carolina to ensure that voters' rights are respected and votes are properly counted. As that initial counting process is finishing up, it finished up for all the counties yesterday. We may now see recounts in some very close contests, including in several legislative races, several local races, and the race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Those recounts are a normal part of our elections process and are carefully done to ensure that the count is fair and accurate. Once all the recounts and any protests are concluded, the State Board of Elections will officially certify this year's election results. Today, in the midst of the process of finalizing these election results, the state legislature is convening for a post-election lame duck session. We are deeply concerned because legislative leaders this morning unveiled a surprise bill that would make significant changes to our election administration and appointment system. And this is done with no public input and without consulting election administrators, and without consulting the minority party in the General Assembly. Some of the changes in this bill include stripping the governor's longstanding legal authority to appoint members to North Carolina's bipartisan State Board of Elections. This is a reversal of what was passed in a separate bill, Senate Bill 749, which is currently under a legal hold. just last year. And so we've seen kind of a reversal from taking the governor's appointment authority and giving it to the General Assembly. Now, instead, taking that authority and giving it to the incoming Republican state auditor. And what that does is it would change the balance of power on the state and county boards of elections by allowing the Republican state auditor to appoint the chair of each of those boards as opposed to the incoming Democratic governor. One thing just to note for context is that in 2018, North Carolina voters emphatically rejected a different, but only slightly different attempt by legislators to radically alter the state board of elections. And by a wide margin of 61%, voters defeated this proposed constitutional amendment. So we encourage lawmakers to respect that result and stop trying to meddle with the state board of elections. Just one last thing I want to share. This bill has many different things in it, but one thing that would be especially harmful for voters is that it changes the process and protections for voters who need to provide some additional information in order for their absentee or provisional ballot to count. Currently, voters have about 9 days after Election Day to provide that additional information. This would shorten that deadline to just 3 days after Election Day, thereby leading to many ballots not being counted for administrative reasons and because there is a desire for quick results instead of accurate and inclusive voting laws. These changes are disappointing to see in this surprise bill that is being pushed through very quickly during this lame duck session. And we know that we are blessed in North Carolina with a strong election system that is safe, secure, and accessible. We don't need these changes in order to have accurate and swift results. What we need is to have patience while every vote is counted, and to ensure that all voters' votes are respected. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. Next up, we have Amy Keith, Executive Director of Common Cause Florida. Amy, take it away.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amy Keith, and I am the Executive Director of Common Cause Florida, as Suzanne just mentioned. So today in Florida, November 19th, the Election Canvassing Commission met to certify Florida's statewide results from the 2024 general election. The results were successfully certified. All Florida counties finalized and certified our local county results yesterday. Voters can view the final totals for Florida in the general election publicly on Florida's State Election Watch website. So that is available for all Florida voters to view. And we are very pleased to see that the election was certified this morning. So according to the Division of Elections in Florida, nearly 11 million Florida voters participated in the general election with a turnout of 78.85%. And no matter the outcome, we know that we all must accept the results of a free and fair and secure election. And at Common Cause, despite the fact that we saw long lines in multiple counties during the general election, we saw voter intimidation at some polling locations. We saw considerable confusion over the new vote by mail request rules. We had 2 hurricanes that hit while the election was ongoing. The statewide voter information lookup tool was down from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. on election day, preventing voters from looking up their voting locations and their voter information. But despite all of those challenges, we were really pleased to see that a great number of registered Florida voters were able to come out and cast their ballots in the 2024 general election with that over 78% turnout. And that we saw that the election certified today. Florida's canvassing boards have been working really hard over the past couple of weeks to make sure that every eligible vote was counted correctly and efficiently, to go through the recount process as required by law where it was needed. And we really do owe all of our election workers an incredible amount of gratitude for the work that they've done and that they continue to do, especially in the face of the added threats and added challenges that have been placed on them over the past couple of years. We will continue to work to improve our elections and our democracy by expanding accessibility. We need to make it easier to register to vote. We need to make it easier to vote by mail. We need to expand early voting options. And there's so much else that we need to do to improve access to the ballot box. so that all Floridians can have a say in the future that they want to build for their families and their communities. We know that the general election is over here in Florida, but we have special elections coming up and municipal elections, both of those coming up in the first quarter of 2025. And it is really important at this time for voters across Florida to remember that as of January 1st, we are going to have another reset of Florida's vote by mail rolls. That means every Florida voter who is currently signed up to vote by mail will be removed from vote by mail as of January 5th, 2025. Every single Florida voter who wants to vote by mail in the 2025-2026 election cycle is going to have to make a new request for a vote by mail ballot. And it is so critical to get that message out now because we do have those really important special elections that are coming up, as I said, in the first quarter of 2025, as well as municipal elections across the state that'll be happening as well in March 2025. So really important to get that message out because the impacts of the election laws that we have seen over the past couple of years, they are ongoing. We saw the impacts of those laws at the lines at polling locations. We saw the impacts of those lines in the questions that we received, both to the election protection hotlines as well as to poll monitors who are out there at the polls, people wondering, why they haven't received their vote by mail ballot, for example. These laws create a lot of confusion for voters. They create a lot of extra hurdles for voters. And honestly, this one, this particular vote by mail reset law, it makes life really difficult for voters and for election administrators because again, after every federal general election cycle, the entire vote by mail roll is wiped and everybody has to sign up again. So again, January 1st, voters who want to vote by mail really do need to make that request again. We also have in the first quarter of 2025, we have Florida's legislative session coming up really fast. As I mentioned, during the 2024 general elections, we did see firsthand the impacts of some of the election laws that have been passed in 2020. And Common Cause Florida in 2025 will continue our ongoing work to prevent any new barriers to voting, to try to make voting easier and to mitigate some of those policies that really did negatively impact voters in the 2024 general election, and to fight back against rising tides of voter intimidation that we are seeing across our state. So we will continue that fight in Tallahassee this spring, and we will be continuing our work to educate voters about the policies and about the vote by mail reset. And of course, we will be out there during the special elections and the municipal elections doing our election protection work as we always do to help make sure that every voter can cast their ballot and have it count. So all elections matter. Local elections, some of the most impactful on people's everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Always great to hear about the work that's happening in Florida, as well as the amazing voter turnout, given all of the hurdles that folks faced. Next up, we have Anthony Gutierrez, the Executive Director of Common Cause Texas. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. Hello from Texas, everyone. Anthony Gutierrez, I'm the Executive Director in Texas. I think to start off, I think both Ann and Amy had a much more exciting turnout to talk about from their states. Here in Texas, we were really excited going into Election Day to see there was 18.6 million registered voters, which was a huge record for Texas. Actual turnout ended up being a different story. We had about 11.3 million. It was about a 61% turnout, which compared to the last presidential was about 6 points less. I think it's really important to just contextualize this, as this was our first presidential election since our legislature passed SB 1 in 2021, which a lot of y'all remember. That was the bill that Texas Democrats fled to DC to break quorum back in 2021. It was a pretty big story for a while as they lobbied to get Congress to take action on voting rights, which they still have not. Here in Texas, I think a lot of the turnout is explained by the fact that in 2020, we had things like drive-through voting in Harris County. There was counties that were implementing 24-hour voting. A number of counties were proactively mailing out mail ballots to qualified Texans who were able to vote by mail. SB 1 outlawed all of those things. It also changed how how the vote by mail process works, making it a little more complex. And I think that certainly contributed to what we saw in turnout. as far as like kind of what we saw on the ground on election day and throughout early vote, it was a relatively quiet election. There were some issues with just people having questions about voter registration, a lot of mail ballot questions, a smattering of like electioneering or things that might fall under intimidation issues. But for the most part, the big problem was just the same problem we've perpetually had in Texas for decades, and that's just too few Texans actually participating. It's the problem that we at Common Cause are going to really be fighting and hoping that our legislature pays attention to, because there are so many things we can do to fix our participation problem in Texas. If we can just focus on that instead of the quote unquote election integrity problem that the politicians in Texas have spent the last decade or so paying attention to. Similar to everyone else here, our legislative session is going to be starting in January, and we're pre-filing has started in Texas. We're not going to see most of the major pieces of legislation until probably January, but we're starting to get hints of what the folks in power are thinking about. And so far, it's things like ending county-wide voting, which is incredibly popular in Texas and would represent a huge systemic obstacle for most Texans if we got rid of that. We're also seeing things like an election marshal bill, which we had to fight to stop in the last legislative session. But thankfully, there are a smattering of also some really positive reforms that we will definitely be lobbying for and advocating for. Things like online voter registration, which, Texas, with our incredibly archaic voter registration system, we're one of the last places in the country where people can't register to vote online. We'll also be trying to push for something called mobile voting, which the legislature outlawed about 2 sessions ago, and it's really made it a lot harder for counties to try to find enough polling places that are ADA compliant and that work for everybody. The mobile voting bill would simply allow counties to set up a poll site for early voting and not have it be a poll site for the entirety of the early voting period, which may sound minimal, but it's when they outlawed it, what it did was it created a situation where a lot of college campuses, for example, they just can't act as a polling site for 2 weeks plus a weekend, but they can do it if we just tell them you only have to do it for like this weekend, for example. So a ton of really good reforms that we're going to be trying to push. And we also do have local elections coming up. We'll have December runoff elections in places like El Paso and a smattering of other local jurisdictions. So we will definitely be out there with our volunteers, taking calls from the hotline, trying to make sure that everyone is able to cast their ballot in December. So stay tuned. And I'll throw it back to Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Always good to hear that despite the uphill climb against bad bills in Texas, there are glimmers of hope with some of those positive reforms. Our final speaker on our panel is Jay Young, Senior Director of Voting and Democracy at Common Cause. Jay?
Good afternoon, everybody. As Susan just said, I'm Jay Young. I'm the Senior Director of Voting Democracy here, and I'm pinch hitting today for Common Cause Georgia. Georgia's voter turnout really was pretty good. It increased by 1.2% compared to the 2020 COVID election. We had almost 5.3 million Georgians participating in the process. Over 73% of registered voters cast their ballots, which reflects a growing trust in the electoral process, despite some of the challenges that we saw, including some bomb threats at polling locations on Election Day. All 159 counties in Georgia certified their election results by November 12th. The state certification deadline will be this Friday, November 22nd. Common Cause Georgia played a vital role in the early voting, Election Day, and post-certification efforts across the state, with a particular focus on Cobb, Fulton, DeKalb, and Forsyth counties. In Cobb County, we saw a high voter turnout, about 79% there. On Election Day, we saw some issues with syncing voting machines and a couple of ballot registration discrepancies. Fulton County voter turnout was around 71%. There, the certification process did extend past the 5 p.m. Deadline on November 12th, but it eventually they got it across the finish line. In DeKalb, we saw voter turnout about 74%. Election day was pretty smooth there, and there were some minor discrepancies, but they were resolved during the certification process. And in Forsyth, we actually saw the highest voter turnout in all the places that we were active. That was about 83%. There were a few ballot rejections there due to some timing issues for UOCAVA voters. So all in told, Common Cause Georgia engaged in election protection efforts at over 150 unique polling places. We particularly concentrated outside of some of the more urban areas, so pretty good coverage in some of the rural parts of the state, covering over 540 shifts and post-certification election, observation efforts from over 200 wonderful, much thanked volunteers. This reflects a strong commitment to voter protection in the state. Looking ahead to 2025, Common Cause Georgia is planning to focus on advocating for disability access and increasing voter registration processes. We also are particularly concerned about the expansion of Spanish language voting resources, particularly in Clayton and Hall counties. During the upcoming legislative session, we're going to be keeping an eye on ongoing misinformation campaigns, particularly those targeting our vulnerable minority communities. We expect there's going to be a bunch of bad bills focused on limiting voter access and election security. So that's primarily what we're going to be focused on. And with that, I will turn it back to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. Always great to hear about the work that is happening in all of our states, including in Georgia. So that does it for our panel. So we're going to turn now to questions from the media, from all of you who are here. It does look like we might be having some technical issues on our side with the Q&A box. So I'm just gonna, so my preference, if possible, is to raise your hand and I will ask you to allow you to talk, come off mute. When you do, please name who you are, your outlet, and if you're directing your question to anybody in particular. First up, it looks like we have Gary Fields. Gary?
Yeah, hi, this is Gary Fields from AP. This question is going to Ann. Is it possible that the governor will veto whatever action that the legislature is taking today? And didn't the legislature just lose their supermajority status? So will any of the action that's taken, if it's vetoed, stand?
That's a great question, Gary. So one important thing to know is that we're in a lame duck session. So we have the current legislature all the way through the end of December. So the newly elected legislature will start in January with a different balance of power in the House, assuming all the recounts land where we think they might. As far as the governor's veto, of course, I don't know. No one ever knows what the governor's going to do until he does it. But I think it's possible, although I want to just make sure that folks understand that these changes were dropped into a bill that includes Hurricane Helene disaster relief, as well as a number of other very significant executive power changes, including really stripping the power of the incoming attorney general to take positions on litigation related to General Assembly actions. And so I think the governor is likely to see a number of things in this bill in addition to the elections law changes that would not align with his values. Although it is certainly a difficult position for all the legislators involved who want to make sure they are supporting our neighbors in Western North Carolina.
Thanks so much, Gary and Anne. Natalia Contreras, you're up next.
Hi, this is Natalia, Vote Beat Texas. Anthony, I have a question for you. I know that ballot secrecy hasn't really been top of mind for a few months. I'm wondering if y'all have heard or have seen any signals of whether the lawmakers in Texas will actually take steps to try to restrict some of the things that are some of the records that are available to the public. We know some of the things that have happened in the past few months have could lead to some voter intimidation in the future. But I'm just curious if y'all have heard anything. I know that there's one bill that's been filed so far, but it would only penalize people, add felonies to anyone who would disclose a voter's identifiable information. But I wonder if there's anything beyond that. And another question too is whether we should really start paying attention to state Republicans really wanting to close the primaries in Texas, and if that would even be a possibility. Thank you.
Just taking notes, make sure I didn't miss any of that, Natalia. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So the first one about ballot secrecy, I also have not thought about that for a few months since everything kind of blew up. Then there was a couple of legislative hearings about it. I feel like this is one that we probably will see a bill on, and just because of how much attention it got during a couple of interim hearings, I'm sure you know the lieutenant governor will usually reserve one of the low number bills. It's like 1 through 15 or 1 through 20 is the bills that like nobody else is allowed to file, and he gets to designate those. One of those for the past few sessions has always been an election omnibus bill that usually contains a lot of terrible things, but I would expect this probably is going to be one of the things included there. It did sound like the Secretary of State had some pretty good recommendations for how we can fix this problem, or at least the perception of the problem. But I have not seen the bill that you're talking about, so I will definitely take a look at that. And you can follow up if I see anything sort of noteworthy. We have in many coalitions been talking about your second question about the likelihood that Republicans will choose to close the primary, and I believe there's already been 3 or 4 bills filed on that one. Honestly, I think this is going to depend a lot on the speaker's race and just sort of how that plays out. Most of the talk about Republicans wanting to close their primary had to do with the fact that they thought they were going to knock out Speaker Phelan if it was a closed primary, which, not a thing I can editorialize about, but that was definitely the motivation. If he ends up being the speaker again, then I would guess you're probably not going to see the closed primary bill moving, but it, from just like nonpartisan, voting rights advocates perspective, though, I do think it would be a disaster. The way that the bills have been crafted, it would require basically everyone having to re-register for every election is so far what some of the experts have been saying, which, compounded on top of the many other systemic obstacles we have within our voter registration and our election system. It would just be just a disaster for turnout if you were requiring Texans to re-register every single time we have an election. But I will also look back at that the ballot secrecy bill and see if I can find anything else for you on that one, Natalia. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthony. And thanks, Natalia, for your question. I am not seeing any additional questions, so we're going to wrap up for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you a million times to our panelists. A reminder that a recording of this briefing will be available on request later this afternoon. To request a link, just reach out to Jennifer Garcia, whose contact information is in the media advisory you received, it's also in the chat. And in case you're not watching the chat, it's jgarcia@commoncause.org. Thank you so much and have a fantastic afternoon, everyone.